In the last video, we saw how extroversion is a trait of positive emotions. It is highly linked to dopamine in the limbic and motor systems. It is closely linked to conditioning and learning new behaviors. And it is also closely linked to motivation and exploration of your social environment. Now, we will see more of its counterpart, which will be neuroticism, which in other words will be the trait of negative emotions and behavioral punishments. People with high neuroticism tend to be more prone to anxiety, depression, and stress, and interestingly enough, women seem to have higher levels of neuroticism than men. The reason for this is that in evolution, women or females used to be the main caregivers of the community. They took care of babies and their families. Therefore, when some type of predator arrived at night, like a tiger making noise, those females who woke up and perceived the dangers better ended up leaving not only themselves, but also their entire species and families alive. And you can really extrapolate this to anything like those females were actually more aware of male aggression, or even from infants when they were crying, and therefore those who were perceiving more of this, they got to send more copies of themselves, and so on. But the thing is that nowadays, with the evolution of society, our cultural environment has changed completely. Although there are still dangers in our society, it is not even close to what it seems or to what it was in the middle of a savanna or a natural environment in the middle of the forest. Therefore, the neuroticism trait is the least adapted to modern human life and ends up being awakened by very small everyday trivialities such as having to pay electricity bills, dealing with stressful people, with traffic, and many other things. Even just hearing someone saying something that you dislike, all of this ends up corroborating to the tendency for women to have, apparently, higher levels of depression and anxiety. One of the reasons being the very biological propensity for this trait. During childhood, there seems to be no great differences between male and female traits, but when puberty arrives, female hormones change their entire bodies, including that of increasing neuroticism. And this can be due to both biological but also social factors, since at this time it is not only the biology of girls that changes, but also the ways of dealing with society and also with society dealing with them. In men, on the other hand, neuroticism and negative emotions ends up being more expressed through aggression and risky behaviors, and also vices like with alcohol and so on. One of the hypotheses for women having higher rates of depression and anxiety is not just due to neuroticism, but that they are actually better at communicating and expressing those negative emotions in a social way. Since in all cultures around the world, women tend to have higher verbal intelligence scores than men. In other words, the stereotypes that women talk more is likely true, because what really happens is that women are much better at putting their emotions into words, while men tend to put their emotions into objects and behaviors, such as sex, drinks, money, and other things. Interestingly, this also is associated with women's preference for literary pornography, as shown in books like Twilight, 50 Shades of Grey, and several other in fanfics and in internet sites. All of this acts much more on the language and imagination parts of the brain, while men prefer the more visual pornography, which stimulates these more sensorial and motor parts of the brain, showing one of the first differences between men and women. But returning to the topic of depression, one of the hypotheses for why women score higher on anxiety and depression indexes is precisely because of this ability to better communicate these feelings, which leads to more tests being done on these people. Thus, the depression tests we have today and the categories and symptoms we see are better at looking at female depression and much less looking at male depression, which could or is expressed in different ways. When we look deeper into neuroticism trait, we see how broad human negative emotions are and our abilities to perceive them. The nerves that exist in our tongues to capture tastes are much broader in perceiving bad and bitter tastes than good and sweet tastes, for example. And the reason for this is that bad and bitter tastes are much more associated with poisons. And evolution needed to find different ways to interpret these things so that we wouldn't die from consuming them. It means that our ability to perceive bad things more than good things is not just something that comes from our minds and our psyche or from our cognition, but it is also something that is built in our own bodies, in our brains, and in our biology. But again, nowadays our environment may not be as conducive to this. Neuroticism ends up being associated with several negative characteristics of human behaviors. Unlike extroversion, for example, people with high neuroticism report lower sexual satisfaction, may fear sex, and feel less attractive. In addition to also reporting not being such good sexual partners and not meeting their partner's needs and desires as much, and also having sex less frequently as a result. All of this shows another cognitive side of people with high neuroticism. They are people who mostly have low self-esteem, low self-efficacy, that is, they do not feel capable of doing the things they would like to do, and do not tend to value themselves as much. In the brain, this is linked to two things. First, the insula, and second, the inhibitory system. Starting with the inhibitory system, it is what makes people control their impulses more and respond to threats with punishment, confusion, and uncertainty. In other words, they do not take as many risks, because if they were to take risks in nature, perhaps something bad could happen. This is completely contrary to the behavior of a person with high extroversion, who will look at this unknown more with the possibility of getting something from it. Even so, personality traits are independent of each other. That is, a person can have both high extroversion and high neuroticism at the same time. Such a person may live in a constant conflict in their own head, because while their extroversion will tell them to go to parties, to be social, to talk to people, to take risks, neuroticism will constantly punish this person by making them feel incapable, paranoid about what other people are thinking, and even feel remorse for having gone to the party and to interact with these people. That's why it is so frustrating to deal with people with high neuroticism. This trait, it is not very functional to today's world. One of the ways that most people deal with it is by creating a safe and comfortable environment so that they don't feel so intimidated by the unpredictability. But there is a contradiction here. Almost all personality disorders have a high correlation with neuroticism, except for antisocial and schizoid personality disorders, which is very interesting. Because even though you might think that having low neuroticism is a good thing, people with very low neuroticism seem to tell us the opposite. If women have higher percentiles of this trait, then men would have lower percentiles. And when we look at those people who have exactly the lowest levels of neuroticism, we find not Buddhist monks and devout religious people, but in fact we find psychopaths and criminals. People who do not feel these negative emotions, who are not stopped by them, and who are not afraid of being punished. People who can do the most heinous things without feeling any remorse at all. These are the people with low neuroticism. In other words, but on the other hand, CEOs of large companies can also have high emotional stability, since their jobs require them to constantly deal with different people and problems that arise all the time. this relationship and being able to maintain their sanity is extremely favored by high positions. That is, it is very important to know how to have a middle ground, as Aristotle stated, to feel these bad things that prevents us from committing dangers that would bring us great harm and even our extinction, but also to know when to ignore these biological warnings so that we can learn to deal with the good things as well. In the end, this division between men and women in this traits is called the Great Variability Hypothesis. It determines how men tend to, not only in the case of personality, but in various fields of biostatistics, to demonstrate greater variability in traits and behaviors than women. In other words, when we look at people with the higher IQs, we see that these people are in fact men. But does that mean that men are more intelligent than women? Well, not at all. Because when we look at people with lower levels and scores of IQ and intelligence, we see that these people are also men. And in the end, the two things end up being canceling each other out, so to speak. And you can say that, well, men are more intelligent than women, but men are also less intelligent and dumber than women. And when you go and end up doing statistics, the average scores between men and women tend to be the same because of this. In evolution, we see this through what it is called the sexual dimorphism, showing that mutations in men tend to occur more than in women. Because if a woman has a very terrible mutation, this will, in quotation marks, compromise the species. But if it were a man doing this, the losses will be smaller. But in contradiction, if it is a good mutation, this would also be more widespread if it were a man. In the words of Charles Darwin himself, in the Novara expedition, a large number of measurements were made of various parts of the body in different races, and the males were found in nearly every case to show a greater range of variation than the females. Dr. Bert Weider has tabulated the cases of 152 individuals with supernumerary digits, of whom 86 were males and 39, or less than half, females. The remaining 27 are of unknown sex. But this does not mean that men are the only ones who do this. Biology is always very relative, because even though one sex presents a lot of variability on one side, in the case of men in terms of behavior or even genetics, the other sex may present variability in other sides. Biologist Richard Dawkins then says that the tendency for women to take more care of their appearances than men may be a sign of this variability in women in today's society as well. Because in nature, men are the ones who tend to have this more variability in their appearances. But knowing the reasons for this ends up falling more in the fields of sociology, evolutionary biology, and psychology, but perhaps also agreeableness, which is not a personality trait, which we will see on the next time. Goodbye.